All right, so let's talk New Year's.
Okay.
You know, the usual
Yeah.
champagne countdowns, maybe a few questionable resolutions.
hmm
But have you ever, stopped to think about why we celebrate new beginnings in the dead of winter?
Right.
It seems a bit odd, right?
It is
Did
interesting
you?
how many cultures throughout history tied their New Year celebrations to things like the harvest or the solstices.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, we're going to explore a totally different perspective on the new year, one rooted in biblical interpretation. We'll be unpacking the teachings of Pastor Shane Vaughn, who argues that March 25th is the true start of the year. Now, before we go any further, I want to make it clear we're not here to endorse Vaughn's views.
Right.
This is about exploring a different perspective, not about convincing you to ditch your New Year's Eve party.
Right. It's about understanding his reasoning and what we can learn from this unique point of view.
So where does this March 25th date come from? It seems pretty random at first glance.
Vaughn bases it on a few things. He points to the book of Exodus, where the first month is connected to the beginning of months,
Uh-huh.
but he also links it to the creation story, specifically the fourth day when Yahweh created time itself.
So because Yahweh established the sun and moon on the fourth day, that makes Wednesday the start of the week and the start of the year.
Right.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection here.
And this is where it gets even more interesting. According to Vaughn's calculations, Passover always falls on a Wednesday, further strengthening his argument that the biblical New Year aligns with these key scriptural events.
Okay, so hold on. Instead of ringing in the new year with champagne and confetti, we should be celebrating with matzah and gefilte fish. Talk about a different kind of party.
Well, Vaughn's point isn't really about the specific foods or festivities, but rather about aligning ourselves with what he believes is Yahweh's intended order. He sees it as a matter of spiritual maturity. In fact, he compares those who focus solely on salvation to kindergartners in their faith.
Kindergarten. That's a pretty bold statement.
He's definitely not afraid to challenge conventional thinking. His point is that there's a deeper level of understanding to be gained beyond the basic tenets of faith. For him, aligning yourself with Yahweh's calendar and commandments shows a deeper commitment. It's about moving beyond simply believing to understanding why you believe.
So for listeners who are really into personal growth, this idea of constantly seeking truth and pushing beyond surface-level beliefs might really resonate.
Yeah.
It's like taking your faith to the next level.
And this is where Vaughn introduces the concept of overcomers.
Overcomers.
Okay.
I'm intrigued. Who are these spiritual superheroes?
Well, maybe not superheroes, but in Ron's theology, overcomers are those who not only have faith in Yahshua, but also strive to keep all of Yahweh's commandments. He believes they're destined for leadership roles in the kingdom.
So it's not just about getting into the kingdom, it's about what you do once you're there.
Yeah.
That's a fascinating perspective.
Exactly. And it's important to note that Vaughn doesn't see this as a salvation issue. He believes salvation comes through faith in Yahshua alone. But he sees this deeper understanding and obedience as a way to unlock a greater purpose within that salvation.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. We got this idea of the biblical New Year, a deeper level of spiritual maturity, and these overcomers who are striving for something more. But how does this all fit in with the churches and denominations we see today?
Well, Vaughn draws a distinction between what he calls apostolic churches and those that truly follow all the apostles' practices, including observing these holy days like the biblical New Year. He seems to be suggesting that many churches that call themselves apostolic aren't actually living up to the name.
That's a pretty bold claim. He's not pulling any punches.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
And to really drive this point home, he invites people to attend a Passover convention he hosts every year at First Harvest Ministries.
So he's not just talking the talk, he's walking the walk.
Absolutely. He emphasizes that this gathering isn't just some random church event, but a commanded one directly ordained by Yahweh. It's about observing this holy day in a way that he believes is true to Scripture.
This is all incredibly thought-provoking. But I'm sure some folks listening are thinking, wait a minute, didn't Yahshua do away with all the Old Testament laws? Doesn't that include these holy days?
Vaughn acknowledges this counterargument, but says he addresses it more fully in his other materials.
Oh, yeah.
He encourages listeners to check out his YouTube videos and booklets for a more in-depth discussion on that topic.
Because he's basically saying, if you want the full scoop, you got to dig a little deeper. All right, fair enough. Let's take a step back for a second and summarize what we've learned so far. We've explored this fascinating idea of the biblical New Year, which falls on March 25th, according to Pastor Shane Vaughn. He believes it's not just about a date on a calendar, but about aligning yourself with Yahweh's created order and demonstrating a deeper level of spiritual maturity.
Right. And this ties into his concept of overcomers, those who strive to keep all of Yahweh's commandments, not just to gain salvation, but as a path to a greater purpose and even leadership in the kingdom.
He's also challenging the way many churches use the label apostolic, arguing that true adherence to apostolic doctrine means following all the practices of the original apostles, including observing these holy days. And he encourages listeners to join him at his Passover convention to experience this firsthand.
It's definitely a lot to take in, but even if you don't agree with everything Vaughn says, I think this deep dive raises some important questions about why we follow the traditions we do.
Exactly. Does simply doing what's always been done make it right?
Hmm.
Or should we be questioning those traditions, digging deeper, and maybe even considering alternate perspectives?
Hmm.
That's something for you to ponder, dear listener.
Hmm.
All right, so
Yeah.
let's move on.
Yeah, let's jump into some of
Yeah.
the specifics
Well,
about
it's
how
amazing.
Vaughn kind of lays this out
Yeah.
in his sermon. So picking up where we left off, it's important to acknowledge that Pastor Vaughn's views are definitely outside the mainstream of Christian thought.
Right.
But that doesn't mean they aren't worth exploring. Sometimes the most profound insights come from challenging the status quo and looking at things from a fresh perspective.
I agree. It's like that saying, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. Sometimes a little shakeup can lead to some real growth and understanding.
Exactly. And I think that's what Vaughn is trying to do with his teachings on the biblical New Year. He's challenging our assumptions about what it means to be a follower of Yahshua, urging us to move beyond passive acceptance and into a more intentional way of living that aligns with Yahshua will.
He's certainly passionate about it, and that passion is definitely contagious. Whether or not you agree with his interpretations, he makes you want to at least consider the possibility that there might be more to the story than what we've always been told.
That's the beauty of deep dives like this. We're not here to tell you what to think, but to provide information and different perspectives so you can form your own informed opinions. And sometimes that means exploring ideas that might seem a little unconventional at first.
So let's dig into some of the specifics. Vaughn talks a lot about these lies that have been perpetuated about the new year. What's he referring to there?
He seems to be suggesting that the traditional January 1st New Year celebration is rooted in paganism and has been adopted by the Christian world without much critical thought. He sees this as a departure from Yahweh's true calendar and a distortion of the natural order.
He's essentially saying we're celebrating the new year on the wrong date based on a calendar that's out of sync with Yahweh's creation.
That's the essence of his argument. He sees this as a symptom of a larger problem, this tendency to blend secular traditions with Christian beliefs without really examining their compatibility.
It's like we've taken these cultural celebrations and slapped a Christian label on them without considering their origins or true meaning.
Precisely. And Vaughn is challenging us to be more mindful of the things we celebrate and the reasons behind them. He's asking us to examine whether our practices are truly aligned with Scripture or if we're just going along with the crowd.
It's easy to just follow what everyone else is doing without stopping to question why.
And that's where Vaughn's idea of spiritual maturity comes in. He believes that part of growing in faith is becoming more discerning, learning to distinguish between truth and falsehood, and aligning ourselves with Yahweh's will.
So it's not just about having blind faith. It's about actively seeking truth, studying Scripture, and wrestling with these big questions.
Absolutely. It's about moving from passive acceptance to active pursuit of knowledge and understanding. And for Vaughn, that includes understanding Yahweh's calendar and its significance in his plan for humanity.
Okay, let's talk more about Yahweh's calendar. Vaughn seems to place a lot of importance on it. Why is it so central to his teachings?
Vaughn believes Yahweh's calendar is more than just a way to mark time. He sees it as a blueprint for spiritual growth, a guide to understanding Yahweh's plan for creation and our role within it.
It's like a roadmap to a deeper relationship with Yahweh.
That's a good way to put it. He believes that by observing these appointed times, like the biblical New Year and Passover, we're aligning ourselves with Yahweh's rhythm and will.
But wouldn't some Christians say that's a bit legalistic?
Mm-hmm.
Many believe we're no longer bound by the Old Testament law, that Yahshua freed us from those restrictions.
That's a valid point, and it's something Vaughn addresses in his other materials. He believes Yahshua didn't abolish the law, but fulfilled it, revealing the deeper spiritual significance of the feasts and holy days.
So it's not about following rules out of obligation, but about understanding the meaning behind them and how they point to Yahshua.
That's how Vaughn sees it. He believes these feasts are prophetic foreshadowing events in Yahshua's life and pointing to future events yet to unfold.
So, for instance, Passover isn't just about the Israelites' escape from Egypt, but also about Yahshua's sacrifice and our freedom from sin.
Exactly. And the biblical New Year, according to Vaughn, is about aligning ourselves with Yahweh's timing for new beginnings, both personally and in the context of his grand plan.
Okay, we've got Yahweh's calendar as a roadmap for spiritual growth, and these feasts as prophetic symbols. But how does this connect back to the concept of overcomers?
Vaughn believes that those who truly understand and observe Yahweh's calendar are stepping into a deeper level of obedience and commitment, showing they're not just casual followers, but dedicated disciples.
They're demonstrating a willingness to go beyond what's considered normal in the Christian world and seek truth even when it's challenging.
Yes, they're showing a dedication to digging deeper and aligning their actions with their beliefs, even when it's difficult. For Vaughn, that includes observing Yahweh's calendar and the feasts he ordained.
So it's not just about knowing the right answers, but about living them out in a way that shows true commitment to Yahweh's will.
Precisely. And for Vaughn, that includes observing Yahweh's calendar and the feasts he ordained.
Okay, so we've covered the theological and spiritual aspects of Vaughn's teachings. But what about the practical side of things? How does he suggest people actually celebrate the biblical New Year?
He doesn't go into a lot of detail about specific rituals or celebrations in this particular sermon. He focuses more on the spiritual significance of the date and its connection to Yahweh's calendar.
So it's more about an internal shift in perspective than about specific outward actions.
That seems to be his emphasis. He's highlighting the importance of aligning ourselves with Yahweh's timing for new beginnings, but he doesn't provide a step-by-step guide.
He does mention eating black-eyed peas and cabbage, though. That's got to count for something, right?
He does mention those foods, but it's not clear if he sees them as having any spiritual significance. It's possible he's simply using them to highlight the difference between the biblical New Year and traditional New Year celebrations in a lighthearted way.
All right, so maybe hold off on the black-eyed peas unless you're a big fan. What about the Passover convention he hosts at First Harvest Ministries? Is that something he recommends for everyone who wants to celebrate the biblical New Year?
He definitely encourages attendance, but he frames it as a commandment from Yahweh, not just a suggestion. He sees it as a way to gather with other believers and observe this holy day in a way that he believes is true to Scripture.
So it's not just about celebrating on your own, but about coming together as a community.
Right. He emphasizes the importance of fellowship and shared experience in strengthening faith and deepening understanding.
It's interesting that he says these gatherings are commanded by Yahweh, while other church events like conferences or retreats are not. He seems to be drawing a clear line between those divinely ordained and those that are more human initiated.
He's definitely highlighting the authority he believes these gatherings have. He sees them as essential for aligning ourselves with Yahweh's will and fulfilling his plan, not simply as social events or opportunities for personal growth.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've discussed the biblical New Year, its connection to Yahweh's calendar, and the concept of overcomers. We've also touched on the practical aspects of observing this holy day and the importance of gathering with other believers. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier. You said that Vaughn believes Yahshua fulfilled the Old Testament law, including the feasts and holy days. Could you elaborate on that a bit more? I think that's something a lot of people might be wrestling with.
Sure, this is a complex theological issue, and it could easily be its own deep dive. But to put it simply, Vaughn believes Yahshua didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, revealing its deeper spiritual meaning.
So it's not about rigidly following the letter of the law, but about understanding the spirit behind it.
Exactly. Vaughn believes the feasts and holy days were prophetic foreshadowing events in Yahshua's life and future events yet to happen.
Can you give us an example of how that works?
Sure, take Passover, for example. Traditionally, it commemorates the Israelites' escape from slavery in Egypt. But Vaughn believes it also points to Yahshua's sacrifice, which frees us from the slavery of sin.
So Yahshua is like the ultimate Passover lamb.
Exactly. And just as the Israelites had to follow specific instructions to be saved from the angel of death, we must accept Yahshua's sacrifice to be saved from spiritual death.
That makes sense. How does this apply to the other feasts, like the biblical New Year?
Vaughn believes each feast has a prophetic significance that connects to Yahshua's life and ministry. He sees the biblical New Year as a time for spiritual renewal and realignment with Yahweh's will, just as Yahshua's coming brought a new era of grace and redemption.
So it's not simply about celebrating on a different date, but about embracing the spiritual transformation Yahshua made possible.
Right, and for Vaughn, that transformation is an ongoing process, not a one-time event. Just as the Israelites celebrated Passover every year to remember their deliverance, we should continually seek spiritual renewal and align ourselves with Yahshua's will, Observing the biblical New Year is one way to do that.
That's an interesting perspective. It definitely challenges how many Christians think about the Old Testament law, but it also opens up fascinating possibilities for understanding these ancient traditions on a deeper level.
That's what's so great about exploring different viewpoints. It can broaden our thinking and help us see familiar things in a new light.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up part 2 of this deep dive. Join us next time as we continue to unpack Pastor Vaughn's teachings and explore what the biblical New Year might mean for our own lives.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Pastor Shane Vaughn's take on the biblical New Year.
Yeah.
As we've been exploring his teachings, I've been struck by how he challenges us
Right.
to move beyond simply believing
Yeah.
and to really grapple with the why behind our faith.
Right.
It's not enough to just have beliefs. He's calling us to live them out actively.
It's a powerful message. He's essentially saying that faith without action is like having a car but never driving it. You might own it, but you're not truly experiencing its potential. Exactly. Yeah. And that's where his concept of the biblical New Year and its connection to spiritual maturity really comes into play.
Right.
It's not just about shifting the date on the calendar. It's about approaching our relationship with Yahweh in a whole new way.
He's advocating for a deeper, more intentional way of living that aligns with Yahweh's will. And a key part of that for Vaughn is observing Yahweh's calendar. He doesn't see it as just a set of rules, but as a guide to understanding Yahweh's plan and timing for our lives.
So by syncing our lives with Yahweh's calendar, we open ourselves up to a deeper connection with him.
That's the idea. It's about aligning ourselves with his rhythm and his will, and that includes observing the feasts and holy days he ordained.
Now, I'm sure some listeners are thinking, okay, this all sounds interesting, but how do I actually observe the biblical New Year? What does that look like practically?
That's a great question. And to be honest, Vaughn doesn't give a ton of practical guidance in this particular sermon. He focuses primarily on the theological and spiritual significance of the date.
So it seems to be more about an internal shift than any specific outward actions.
That seems to be his emphasis. While he talks about aligning ourselves with Yahweh's timing for new beginnings, he doesn't lay out any specific steps for doing so.
He does, however, invite people to attend his Passover convention at First Harvest Ministries.
Right.
Perhaps that's where he gets into the practical details of observing these holy days.
That's certainly a possibility. He definitely emphasizes the importance of gathering with other believers and experiencing these feasts communally.
It's interesting how he differentiates those gatherings from other church events like conferences or retreats
Right.
by saying they are commanded by Yahweh.
Uh-huh.
He seems to be drawing a clear distinction between events that are divinely ordained and those that are more human-driven.
He's definitely emphasizing the authority he believes these gatherings carry. He sees them as essential for aligning ourselves with Yahweh's will and fulfilling his plan, going beyond simply being social or personal growth opportunities.
Okay, so maybe the specifics of how to celebrate are open to interpretation. But what about the WHY? Why does Vaughn believe observing this particular date is so important even for those who already celebrate the traditional New Year on January 1st?
He sees it as a sign of deeper commitment to Yahweh, a willingness to go beyond the norm and align oneself with what he believes is Yahweh's true calendar.
It's like saying, I'm not just following the crowd, I'm actively seeking truth, even when it's challenging or unpopular.
Precisely. And for Vaughn, that's a key characteristic of the overcomers he talks about. They're not content with a surface-level understanding of faith. They dig deeper, seeking truth and living out their beliefs in a tangible way.
And he believes this level of commitment is what prepares them for leadership roles in the kingdom.
That's his belief. He sees this understanding and obedience as unlocking a greater sense of purpose and authority in the kingdom.
So it's not about earning salvation,
Right.
but demonstrating a level of dedication that makes one worthy of a greater role.
Yes, like the difference between being a student and being the teacher. Both are valuable, but the teacher has a different level of responsibility and authority.
That's a great way to put it. Even if listeners aren't fully convinced by all of Vaughn's teachings,
Uh-huh.
I think there's a lot to take away from this deep dive.
Absolutely. It challenges us to think critically about our traditions and the reasons behind our beliefs. It encourages us to delve deeper into Scripture, to seek truth, and to live our faith authentically and intentionally.
And hey, it might even make you think twice about that New Year's Eve champagne toast.
Whether you choose to celebrate the biblical New Year or not, the key takeaway is this. Don't just go along with the crowd. Seek truth, question your assumptions, and be open to new perspectives. That's what true spiritual growth is all about.
Well said. And that wraps up our deep dive into Pastor Shane Vaughn's take on the biblical New Year. We hope this exploration has sparked some curiosity and maybe even inspired you to reflect on your own faith journey. Remember, it's a personal journey and there's no one right way to do it. But by staying curious, open-minded, and committed to seeking truth, we can all grow in our understanding of Yahshua and his plan for us.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep growing.